It's my great pleasure to be talking to Dr. John Huddlestun, Professor of Religious Studies at College of Charleston. And I want to learn something about the Bible. I've always been fascinated by it. We're all familiar with the idea that the first chapter of Genesis, the creation myth of the Jews, is not historical. But what about the rest of Genesis? What about Abraham? Did Abraham ever exist?
Probably not. I think if you look at the book of Genesis, which is presented as a kind of family history, if you continue down and even look at the book of Exodus, historically speaking or archaeologically speaking, there really is no evidence for any of the events that took place in either of those books.
There was no captivity of the Jews in Egypt, for example.
There's no evidence from Egypt for any of that at all. The only evidence, the only mention of Israel, in fact, the very earliest mention of the name Israel outside the biblical text is an Egyptian text that dates to around 1200 BCE, and it mentions this one particular pharaoh says he conquered a number of peoples to the north, and among the list of peoples he defeated, the name Israel appears. But it doesn't tell us anything else about what that Israel means. It's simply the name Israel, which probably in this case refers to a people or maybe the land they inhabit. But you can't say anything else about that other than the name appears at that point.
But even that, 1200 BC is not very old, is it? That's...
In terms of ancient Near Eastern history, no. The biblical history and characters like Abraham and Moses, in terms of the larger ancient Near Eastern or ancient Middle Eastern history, they appear very late on the scene.
Yes. So the whole sort of Jewish tribal myth of being taken in captivity to, Abraham first and then Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, taken into captivity in Egypt, led out of Egypt by the great hero Moses, Moses coming down from the mountain with the Ten Commandments. No historical basis at all to any of that?
Yeah, there's simply no evidence for that. People cite what they might call circumstantial evidence. For example, in the history of ancient Egypt as a whole, going back long before the biblical text, you do have Semites, people from the north who from time to time came down to Egypt for various reasons. Some scholars have argued it's not impossible that some tiny little group maybe of Semites or Asiatics left Egypt at one point, wound up in the Arabian or desert, met up with another group of people who worshiped this god named Yahweh, for example, and then wound up going up into Palestine, meeting with another group, and that became, over time, what we call Israel.
Well, I wanted to come on to the God and gods. Mm-hmm. The Jewish religion, of course, is famously monotheistic, and Christianity and Islam have inherited this monotheism. How did that start? Were they originally polytheistic and then settled on one tribal god, or how did it work?
You have to distinguish between Judaism, and when you use the term Jew, and talk about ancient Israelite religion, because they're actually very different types of things. But to come to the question of monotheism, it only appears, based on what we know from the text, at a fairly late period in the period of the exile or just before the exile.
The exile meaning to Babylon.
Right, the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. But even there, that's the first time you get a reference to there's this particular god and no other gods.
And that's astonishingly recent, only 600 BC.
Or actually, later than that, probably maybe in the 530s or 540s.
So monotheism is not that old in Jewish history.
No. Before that, they had their one god, the national god that they worship. But it's clear from the text that there were other gods around.
Which they believed existed, but they damn well better not worship them, yes. Yeah.
Well, even that's problematic because the prophets, as you know, the prophets are constantly going on rants against people worshiping other gods and the way they worship other gods, which tells you, there must have been other gods. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so concerned about this. But there
were other tribes. Other Canaanite tribes who worshipped other gods. Was that how it worked? Or
what we know about in the ancient Israelites, not simply in the biblical text, but outside the biblical text from archaeological evidence and other kinds of inscriptions, is that people worshipped Israel's main god, who has the name Yahweh, pronounced something like Yahweh, but they also worshipped other gods as well. There's a very famous inscription written on a big part of a big jar from the 8th century BCE that mentions Israel's God Yahweh, and it says Yahweh and his Asherah. Asherah is the name of a Canaanite goddess, and that inscription seems to indicate that they worship Yahweh as the male deity, and then Asherah was his female consort. There's a lot of evidence for that.
Yes.
But you won't see that in the biblical text. The biblical text presents the kind of official history of what it should have been. But when you get outside of that and look at archaeological and other evidence for family religion or household religion or private religion, it's another story.
Yeah, right. Now, what about King David? Is he a historical figure?
Good question. We have no evidence for David existing in the 10th century. We have no evidence for Jerusalem in the 10th century under David and Solomon being this capital of a mighty empire with international relations, the way the biblical text presents it. But it's difficult. You can't make the claim that David simply didn't exist. It could have been, David and Solomon could have been what are fairly minor kings.
Sort of tribal chieftains.
Yeah, with a very small, I don't know if I'd use the word state. The only evidence that's come to light outside of the biblical text, because that's what people usually talk about, is an inscription that in the midst of this inscription, it talks about the house of David. By house of David, they mean the dynasty of David. But that's a text that's a couple hundred years later. But people have made the argument, if there's a house of David, then obviously there must have been a David to establish this kind of dynasty. But in terms of actual evidence, archaeological evidence, or other kinds of evidence, we simply have nothing that puts a David or a Solomon in this period. What's interesting is all their connections with all these other nations and marrying the daughters of other kings. That we know of later kings, not David and Solomon, but after David and Solomon, kings of the northern kingdom, like what Omri and the Omride dynasty, they apparently were very powerful and influential figures.
Okay, so you mentioned the northern kingdom. We're coming on now to the split between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Now that's real, is it? There really were two kingdoms, and the list of kings that we have for those two kingdoms, are they pretty authentic?
Well, all you can say is we do have references outside the biblical text, in the Assyrian text, for example, that mention some of these kings by name. But what's interesting is they mention kings that the biblical writers don't like. If you take Ahab, for example, you may know Ahab is not a very nice character in the biblical text. The biblical text portrays him as a very weak military figure. But if you look at texts outside the Bible, Assyrian texts again, Assyrian annals or military inscriptions, they clearly show that Ahab and that dynasty and Omri and Jehu were powerful and influential kings. So you have a disconnect between how the biblical text presents this, because the biblical writers have their own theological or ideological assumptions. They're writing a theological history. And it's much different when you get some kind of information outside the text.
Well, you make frequent reference to the distinction between biblical texts and texts from outside the Bible. You seem to be making the assumption that biblical texts are not to be taken seriously unless there's some authentication from outside authorities. Why is that? Why do you devalue the biblical text compared to the outside?
I would say none of these ancient texts, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Hittite, Edomite, Moabite, take all those people, none of those texts should be read face value. Right. Any serious historian who practices, history, the discipline of history or historiography, you don't just read the text you don't read the text and assume everything happened. You have to have other ways of dealing with the text. In the biblical text, there are cases where we have outside evidence to corroborate a biblical narrative or the existence of a king who did certain things. At other times, the evidence points in the opposite direction. So you hear some people say, well, the Bible, it's all true or it's all false. And that's a horrible false dichotomy.
Yeah. Well, yes, okay.
You have to look at each example on its own.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, what about the Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold? That was a historical event, the Assyrian invasion of the northern kingdom, was it?
Is that from Nahum? I know I'm asking you, a biblical scholar.
Oh, that's not, no, that's a poem by,
that is based on the book of Nahum.
Okay.
Nahum is a it's a very short little, everyone's favorite biblical book, Nahum and Habakkuk, I always say. That actually was the destruction of Nineveh in 612, which the biblical writer is rejoicing that the Assyrian city, the capital city, was destroyed. And gloating in incredible ways over the destruction, and talking about women and children literally being dashed against the rocks as they were killed. It's a wonderful text.
What about the Babylonian captivity?
That there clearly was some kind of exile, but not on the level or the scale that the biblical text presents.
So it wasn't that an entire people was carted off to Babylon.
It wasn't an empty land. This is how scholars deal with this, the whole kind of empty land idea. We think that everyone was carted off to Babylonia, marry their, marry Babylonian wives, have 2.5 Babylonian
By the waters
kids
of Babylon we sat down and wept. Yes.
But they would have taken off people into exile who were of use to them. So the king and anyone connected with his the whole bureaucracy, people who had a particular talent that they would find useful. But there were a lot of people that stayed back in the land. And there were people who didn't come back out of exile from Babylon. Babylon, as you know, in Jewish history became a major center for Jewish learning, and therefore you have the Babylonian Talmud. So
a lot of the biblical books were written in Babylon, were they?
That's a good question. When they come back, there's this guy named Ezra who comes back. And the text says he brings with him some kind of book of the law of Moses. We don't know exactly what that was. People assume it was some kind of form of maybe what we call the Pentateuch, maybe a few books after that, but there's no actual way of knowing. He had some text, and he had a text because the Persian king who oversaw when they're coming back under Persian authority, and the Persians want the different peoples who were going back to their homelands to reestablish their laws, rebuild their temples, which is what it says in the text they're doing. This was all done to the Persian king's advantage, to set up these outlying provinces and to keep them under control, allow them to establish their own laws. What's amazing in the biblical text is all of that is done under Persian authority, and they even offer sacrifices on behalf of the Persian king in Jerusalem.
Now, what about the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so on? When and where did they happen, if they did?
I know I keep saying this, but that's a good question. Here you find disputes among scholars that these oracles, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Amos, the actual oracles associated with them were probably written down over a long period of time. You're talking possibly 300 or 400 year period.
Oh, so they're not individual prophets at all?
Well, the issue is, to what extent can you go back and find an historical Amos, for example, or an historical Hosea, because the oracles that may have been written by disciples of theirs. We have a reference to this in the book of Isaiah, that he had followers or disciples, and we know people over time would write down oracles. There are disputes about, did these actual figures actually exist at one point, and how much of the oracles presented in the books actually go back to that figure. That's a debated issue. There clearly, aside from that, there clearly are additions to these books. People would go in and add another prophecy to update the book. So if a prophet is saying Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, and it wasn't destroyed, then at a later period after Jerusalem is destroyed, they go in and add. Okay. There are famous cases of where the biblical writers actually, we know they did this.
Yes, I mean, not least, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son and call his name Emmanuel. I mean, Isaiah, and that of course was taken up by Matthew to refer to Jesus, who wasn't called Emmanuel. Tell us about that.
Well, I actually do a whole class on that verse. That's Isaiah 7:14. Because in the biblical in the Hebrew text, the original text, the word is not virgin.
A young woman.
The word is a young woman or maiden. The word is Alma. Yes. And the word has a definite article. So it's the young woman. In the biblical text, the prophet Isaiah is standing in the company of the king, Ahaz, and he's saying, in the Hebrew text, it's behold, this woman who's standing here, who is with child, is going to have a son and is going to name him Emmanuel. And then you have to read the rest of the text, because the rest of the text is, before this child is too old, before this child eats hard foods, for example, depending on how you interpret this, these two kings before whom you are in dread, which are the kings of Aram or Syria and Israel, they will disappear. This is the whole point of the text.
Yeah.
The text
So
really
it's
has nothing to do with
future.
It's very I should explain.
The near future.
It's very near future.
Yeah.
So you say, well, then how did Matthew get virgin out of this? He got that from the Greek translation, which has parthenos. It's related to the word for Parthenon.
Yeah.
And
that parthenogenesis, indeed, as a biologist, yes.
And that term then is picked up by the writer in Matthew. That gospel, by the way, more than any other gospel, has a very, Matthew constantly uses what we call fulfillment citation formulae, where he goes back to find a text.
Yes.
Never mind the text has nothing to do with what's going on in this period. It's just go find a text that somehow is related to Jesus in Egypt, for example.
Yeah. And that particular verse from Isaiah, Matthew actually says, now all this was done.
Yeah.
That the prophet...
That's the citation formula.
Yeah.
He does the same for...
Yes.
Yeah, he does it for other texts, but they literally bear no... They're not even, most of them aren't even prophecies.
Now Matthew obviously was not Matthew Levi, the tax collector. Do we know who Matthew was? Do we know who Mark was, Luke was, John was?
No. Okay. The Gospels are written by anonymous figures whose names are later added to the text. You can even see it in some cases in the manuscript tradition. The titles you see for books, like the Gospels, the Gospel according to so-and-so, in antiquity they didn't have these titles. You would have had simply a story that circulated, and over time it becomes associated with a particular figure.
When were the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John grafted onto those Gospels?
The bulk of the Gospels, in terms of the manuscript tradition, you have to go all the way into the 4th century.
4th century AD?
Yeah, in roughly the middle of the 4th century. There are some fragments of different Gospels. There's one very small piece of a fragment of the Gospel of John, which could be 2nd century. When you get to that point, there you have in the manuscript tradition where they're writing a name. In some cases, the name is not even at the top of the gospel.
Yeah.
In some cases, it's written on the side of a manuscript. It's written at the end. But it's clear that the name attached to it was not the primary.
So who would have decided we're going to assign this one to Matthew and this one to Luke? And
I don't know.
You don't know. Okay.
That's a good question.
What about all the other Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas and all the other Gospels that have strange stories in them and things, the non-canonical Gospels?
Right. Like the Gospel of Thomas is probably the most famous because in that case there are some sayings in the Gospel of Thomas that are very close to the New Testament Gospels. And there are debates among scholars still about to what extent would the writer of the Gospel of Thomas had known the Gospels in the New Testament, or is he getting those sayings attributed to Jesus from an independent source that was also the source for the writers of the New Testament? The Gospel of Thomas we don't have a manuscript in the manuscript tradition in Greek or Coptic, because the full Gospel you find later in Coptic tradition. It's much later, so it's difficult to determine how far back you can trace those traditions.
Okay. How much of the character of Jesus was invented by Paul, and how much do you think is historical?
Actually, I think Paul knew very little about Jesus. In terms of actual facts about Jesus' life, Paul gives us literally a handful of bits of information.
Nothing in the epistles,
he knows he has brothers. He knows about the Last Supper, which, by the way, is not in the Gospel of John. He knows other bits of scattered information. But Paul, if he knew more about the historical Jesus, he's not telling us, because Paul's total focus is on Jesus' death and resurrection. And for Paul, because he had some kind of experience, he had some kind of vision or experience, and that appears to motivate everything else he's writing in his letters, because he's trying to figure out how to reconcile this vision or revelation he had with what is basically his tradition, Jewish tradition. And he keeps both. He doesn't reject Judaism at all. He still remains we would say observant Jew. We use that today. I wouldn't use that for the ancient world. There's a very famous passage, well, famous to me. It's a passage in the book of Acts that says, Paul came back to Jerusalem at one point, and the leaders in Jerusalem said to him, who were very conservative, by the way, one of whom was James, Jesus' brother. They're still saying you have to be circumcised, you have to keep the Sabbath, you have to keep kashrut, the food laws. It's a very conservative wing of the church. They are telling Paul, Paul, we have a problem here. You're out there talking to Gentiles, to non-Jews, and telling them they don't have to keep the law, they don't have to do all these things. And the people here in Jerusalem think you're telling everyone they don't have to keep the law. And so they ask Paul to take a vow and to do certain things. And by taking this vow, he is showing people, no, I'm still observant, I still follow the law. But there's a lot of whole new scholarship going on with how people understand Paul in the last 2 decades.
Okay. How much do we actually know about the historical Jesus?
It depends on who you talk to. There are different methods or criteria that scholars over the last even 200 years have devised to say, how do you get back to the actual authentic sayings or deeds? And there was an historical Jesus, by the way, so that's not an issue. I should say that there's no Roman evidence at all in the 1st century. There are no Roman documents that refer to Jesus. The earliest Roman evidence comes in the early 2nd century with Pliny, with a guy named Tacitus, for example. That's very, very little information. All we know is he was executed during the reign of Tiberius, and then the Jewish historian Josephus at the very end of the 1st century talks about, he has a brief passage about Jesus. He also has a passage about James, his brother. It's everyone kind of reconstructs their own historical Jesus, I think sometimes based on the generation. So you get some scholars now, very prominent scholars, who create a kind of warm and fuzzy egalitarian Jesus who rages against the colonial Romans and all this kind of stuff. A lot of that is problematic. I think that based on other Jewish groups in this period, I would say he probably had a fairly strongly apocalyptic message that the kingdom was coming very soon.
And coming soon.
Right, yeah.
Which was not uncommon among prophetic figures of his time, isn't that right?
Right.
Now, is it right that his name is, Jesus is the Roman form. What would the Jewish form of his name have been?
Yeshua or Joshua.
Yeah,
Joshua is also the same form.
A very common name.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, when we say, was Jesus a real figure, what we're saying is there was a wandering preacher whose name was Yehoshua.
Jesus of Nazareth, by the way.
Of Nazareth.
The Gospel of John knows that his father was Joseph and that he was born in Nazareth. Probably no one, well, I shouldn't say no one, but the general view of scholars is that he was not born in Bethlehem.
No, I mean, the Bethlehem thing is another of those fulfilling a prophecy thing. That's the prophet Micah.
Based on Micah, exactly.
So once again, the Gospel writers, Matthew and Luke, I think, had to get him to Bethlehem and they got him to Bethlehem by different routes.
The same, exactly. There, and the virgin birth narrative. I don't think Paul doesn't seem aware at all of the virgin birth narrative. And what I think is interesting is the writer in the Gospel of John seems not to be aware of that narrative at all. And
John actually refers to him as coming from Nazareth with no mention of...
Right. In John, the people say, the Messiah from Nazareth?
Yes.
Because they assume, we know this guy's from Nazareth. Yes. So what it's saying is that he was clearly not born in Bethlehem.
Yes. Yeah. So the whole Bethlehem story, the whole virgin birth story, is just fulfilling Old Testament prophecies, and admittedly so. I mean, no.
Well, there are no actual virgin birth prophecies either. I mean, it's
that's just a mistranslation. What surprises me is that I've talked to respectable, sophisticated theologians, including the recently retired Archbishop of Canterbury.
I watched that debate, by the way.
And I said, of course, you don't believe in the virgin birth, do you? And he said, well, yes, I do, as a matter of fact. And I was absolutely bowled over by this because I expected fundamentalists to believe in the virgin birth, but for a respectable archbishop to believe in the virgin birth.
Well, in Catholic scholarship, by the way, has it changed drastically after Vatican II in the early 60s. Some of the most highly respected, knowledgeable, excellent scholars in New Testament happen to be Catholic scholars. And if you take one example, Raymond Brown, who was one of the leading scholars.
Robin, are you making signals? What are you doing? Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
It's all right. One very famous scholar who published a book about the birth of Jesus, and he was one of the most highly respected scholars, a Catholic scholar and a priest, by the way. He argued in very in a roundabout way, but he basically was saying there was no virgin birth.
Yeah.
Which was, he just was going through the material, and he, as a Catholic scholar, he had to conclude that. So.
But once people knew that it was a mistranslation from Isaiah's Hebrew to the Greek virgin, why does any scholar even bother to talk about a virgin birth, since it's known that it came from this deliberate fulfilling of an Old Testament prophecy?
Well, the idea of a virgin birth, or the idea of being that you are the product, that your father was a god and your mother was a human, that in Greco-Roman period, in this period we're talking about, it's extremely common. Anyone who was important at all, whether an emperor, a philosopher, an athlete, we should do Michael Jordan. If you were anyone important who made a contribution to Roman society, if you were a great benefactor, you of course would have been born of Zeus or some other god, and your mother would have been human. It was extremely common.
Yes.
So the surprising thing would be if a gospel writer chose not to say Jesus was born of a virgin and his father was divine.
Yes.
You would have to.
And could you say the same thing of the resurrection of Jesus as well? That again is a common myth, isn't it? Among gods of that period, and that
I don't know as much about the Greco-Roman period, but you can talk about earlier ancient Near Eastern.
Yes.
In Canaanite mythology, for example, with the whole discussion of Osiris in Egyptian texts.
Yes.
But there's been a lot of scholarship over the last couple of decades that have shown the whole idea of a dying and rising God, this kind of traditional idea we think of. It is problematic in some ways, the way people read text. You can't simply apply it to the New Testament the way some people have done.
What about the idea of the scapegoat? What about the idea of dying in order to take sin away? Is that a very common? I mean, that's obviously deep in Christian theology. Is that also a very common?
It seems you could apply that to, in Jewish tradition, Yom Kippur, which is this idea of the goat. When we talk about the goat, there were two goats in Leviticus 16, where the one goat is sent out into the wilderness, and the other goat, they put their hands on the goat and transfer the sins of Israel.
All the sins go into the goat. Yes.
And the one goat. But even that idea about substitutionary atonement is more problematic in later Jewish tradition. I should say that the story about Isaac in Genesis 22, where he's almost sacrificed, later Jewish tradition, and there are all kinds of interesting material on this, went back and read that story and said, well, no, he wasn't actually killed, but he nicked him with a knife, for example, and he lost so much blood. Or how much blood did he lose? If he lost this much blood, that's kind of an atoning thing. If he lost this much blood, and it's a very fascinating tradition that's post-biblical. But one scholar, actually a scholar you may know from Oxford, Geza Vermish, a well-known scholar, wrote decades ago a long essay about how he believed these stories about Isaac as a sacrifice that was meritorious for the ancestors or the descendants. There's a name for this in Jewish tradition. That he argued that those traditions in Judaism influenced Christianity and how they understood Jesus, and also the passages in Isaiah 53 about a servant who is suffering, and a servant that dies, those passages are problematic in their own way.
Which was taken up by the Essenes of the Dead Sea Scrolls, wasn't it? That tradition of the suffering servant.
Other different groups looked at those passages differently. The debate about those passages is outside of Isaiah 53. If you look at the earlier passages, starting in chapter 40 and following, you have this servant who appears at different times. And the servant is, in the biblical text, clearly identified as Israel. There's no question. They said, my servant Israel, for example. Except when you get to Isaiah 53, then it's more problematic about what's going on with the servant. One very common view among scholars is the servant is the head of this community of exiles who was then maybe beaten or possibly killed by the Babylonians for various reasons. And there's another whole discussion about what historically would have happened at the time these chapters were written. But that's a much different thing than moving down 500 years, 600 years, and talking about how people use the text later.
Yes.
That's the case with all the things we're talking about.
As a biologist, I'm used to the idea that one of the greater threats to religious belief comes from my own subject of biology, well, science generally, but more specifically evolutionary biology. But talking to you, I'm starting to get the idea that actually looking as a historian at the Bible might be an even greater threat to religious faith. What do you think about that?
Yes, it depends on what people. I mean, students who come to my classes come from all different approaches or spectrums. Some students assimilate this kind of material and somehow, in some ways, partition it and just go on and carry on still a part of their tradition. And other people don't. I mean, I couldn't say, you're right, in some cases it is a threat if you're taking a passage like Isaiah 7:14 and saying, this is not actually what's going on in the passage. You could choose to say, I would ignore the actual history of all this stuff, and I only care about how people later decided to read and interpret these texts.
So there's almost nothing left of the history. I mean, there's nothing left of the ancient Jewish history. There's nothing, I mean, as far as religion is concerned, there's very little left of New Testament.
No, I wouldn't. That's another. I wouldn't say that. I would say, I mean, if you're talking about biblical history in the Old Testament, there's a lot of narratives that are clearly, generally historical narratives.
Well, yes, I'm sure, but the whole foundational myths of the Jewish religion, Moses leading the Jews out of Israel, out of Egypt, you get rid of that. You get rid of King David. And then as far as Christianity is concerned, you get rid of the virgin birth, you get rid of the resurrection.
You're just ticking them all off.
Very little known about Jesus himself at all. You're not left with a hell of a lot as far as religion is concerned, are you?
That's why I'm a Bible scholar.
Yes. Well, Dr. Huddlestun, thank you very much indeed. It's been a great privilege.
Thank you very much.